So Carl, I figured I would try something a little bit different today with my look. I pulled my hair back, and I kind of feel like maybe I look a little bit like that guy, like Ragnar Lothbrok from Vikings, that Amazon show. Only if you ordered him from Wish.com? What does that even mean? Hi, and welcome to this video lecture, where apparently we don't like to build each other up, but would rather tear each other down. Today, we're going to look at the Exodus story. Now, the Exodus story is very rich with material, so we can't focus on everything. So I'm going to provide a general summary of the story, but then I want to spend the remainder of the video focusing on one particular aspect of the narrative, and that is the interesting nature of the relationship between Moses and God. Let's get started. The Exodus narrative is one of the most famous narratives in all of Scripture. It's extremely important for a number of reasons. It's about slaves being rescued from slave masters. For this reason, the narrative has been very important to oppressed and marginalized groups. It's also a narrative about God reaching out and demonstrating God's power in history. It is one of the most important narratives for Jewish people today, and the narrative serves as the beginning of a number of important holidays, the most famous of which being Passover. Let's take a few moments here to summarize the narrative, and then we'll get into our specific focus, that is the relationship between Moses and God. To understand the narrative of Exodus, we have to go back to the Abrahamic covenant, where God promises Abraham land, many descendants, and also a great nation. As we know, Abraham has a son named Isaac with his wife Sarah. Isaac has two sons, twins, one named Esau and the other named Jacob, with his wife Rebekah. Jacob actually has 12 sons and favors one of them, Joseph, with his wife Leah, his other wife Rachel, and their two maidservants. Man, that's a story. The other sons get jealous and sell the favorite son into slavery. Joseph ends up in Egypt, where, by divine providence, he ends up being Pharaoh's second in command and saves Egypt from a terrible famine. During the famine, Joseph brings his whole family, including the brothers who betrayed him, awkward, to Egypt. This is interesting because Abraham's descendants left the land that God promised to Abraham, the land of Canaan, for a cushy life in Egypt. And they do well in Egypt. Like, really well. They prosper and they multiply. After a while, another pharaoh comes into power, and he doesn't remember all the super awesome things Joseph did to save Egypt. This pharaoh becomes threatened by the success of the Israelites and decides to enslave them. He also kills the male infants, but one male infant escapes by being shipped downriver on an itty-bitty boat. I'm on a boat! This infant, whose name is Moses, ends up being raised in Pharaoh's own household. He lives well in Egypt until he kills an Egyptian who is abusing an Israelite slave. Moses then flees Egypt and ends up becoming a shepherd of a priest of Midian. He also marries the priest's daughter, Zipporah. Meanwhile, things are worse than ever back in Egypt, where a new pharaoh has taken over. One day, Moses comes across a burning bush, which speaks to him. It turns out the bush represents God, and God says, "Hey, I know that life sucks down in Egypt, so I'm going to send you down there to rescue the people." Moses is hesitant to go, so God gives Moses a super powerful stick and a sidekick, his brother Aaron. When Moses goes down to Egypt, the new pharaoh isn't keen on letting his slaves go. So Moses, Aaron, and God engage in a power struggle with Pharaoh. Long story short, Pharaoh loses his power struggle after 10 plagues, the last of which is the killing of the firstborn sons of Egypt, which is where we get the celebration of Passover. This plague demonstrates that Pharaoh is out of his league. The Israelites leave Egypt, but they have a lot of struggles to overcome, like where to get food and water and, what to do about Pharaoh's army, which is chasing them after Pharaoh decides he wants his slaves back. God keeps providing for the people. There can be miracles when you believe, though hope is fail. That's not how that goes, is it? Eventually, God leads the people to a special mountain where God dictates the terms of a covenant, or the Mosaic Law, to Moses. These terms include the 10 Commandments, but also a bunch of other commandments that are super important, like the command to care for the poor and the marginalized. The people put the terms of this covenant in a really cool box, the Ark of the Covenant, which, as we know, gives the Nazis a really hard time later on in history. Oh wait, sorry, I'm being told that that's the plot of the first Indiana Jones movie. I swear it's like things on the internet aren't even true. The people also build a portable temple and establish a religious order of priests. This Mosaic Law and the religious order, including the notion of a temple, become central aspects of Israelite religion and remain important for Jews today. Now, to be clear, when I mention that the temple is still important for Jews today, the temple no longer exists. The first temple, which will be built by Solomon, is destroyed by Babylon in 586-587 BCE. The second temple, which was built after the return to exile and was further established by the work of King Herod, is destroyed in 70 CE, after a Jewish revolt against Rome. Since that temple was destroyed, the temple has not been rebuilt, and the only remains of the temple now are the Wailing Wall, the Eastern Wall, in Jerusalem. Now, as noted, there are many fascinating aspects of this narrative, and and we could spend a whole semester, a whole year discussing and unpacking them. So for this video, I want to hone in on one particular focus, and that is the interesting nature of the relationship between Moses and God. To unpack the nature of this interesting relationship, I'm going to focus on 7 things that happen between God and Moses. These things might challenge the way we think about what it is to be in a good or healthy relationship with God, but it might help us to rethink what it means to be a faithful person, since Moses is considered by many Jews to be the faithful person par excellence. Let's take a look at these 7 features. First, when God asks Moses to go down to Egypt, Moses is all kinds of not on board with it. In fact, in numerous ways, Moses tries to get out of it. For example, in Exodus chapter 3, verses 10 through 12, the text states, "So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" This is strike one, Moses, and God comforts Moses by responding that God will be with Moses in this task. But then, in Exodus chapter 3, verse 13, the text states, "But Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" And again, God responds graciously by revealing to Moses the divine name. This name is so sacred that many Jews won't even speak it. And in fact, in the English translations of the Bible, it just appears as Lord with all caps. So God is going to be with Moses, and God has revealed to Moses the divine name, this special knowledge. Surely Moses is on board now. But then again, in chapter 4, verse 1, Moses says, "But suppose they do not believe me or listen to me, but say, 'The Lord did not appear to you.'" He's just so whiny. Anyway, this is when God gives Moses a super powerful stick that I would also like to think maybe secretly could turn into a lightsaber, but like Moses never unlocked that power. Maybe he didn't level up high enough. I don't know. At any rate, the stick is cool and it can turn into snakes and things like that. It's like that guy from The Legend of Zelda who's like, "Hey, it's a dangerous journey. You should take this sword with you." Except it's God speaking and God gives him a stick instead of a sword, and the sword can turn into snakes and stuff. Actually, now that I think about it, it's not really anything at all like The Legend of Zelda, but whatever, it's a cool stick. Surely Moses is on board now, except in chapter 4, verse 10, Moses says, "Oh my Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor even now that you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." Anyway, when Moses claims about not being able to speak well, God comforts Moses by saying, "I'm the one who's going to fill your mouth with words." So we're all good. Now you don't have to worry about that either. But then, in chapter 4, verse 13, Moses just flat out lays his cards on the table and says, "Oh my Lord, please send someone else." At this point, God gets angry at Moses, and God sends Moses' brother Aaron, who suddenly appears in the narrative, to come and help Moses in this task. Because let's face it, everyone needs a sidekick. Every Batman needs a Robin. Every Superman needs a... Okay, wait, that didn't work out the way I thought it was going to. So the first thing to note is that Moses tries very hard to get out of God's calling. The second thing that's interesting is that God actually tries to kill Moses. See, up to this point, God has seemed very patient with Moses, even though Moses keeps trying to get out of doing what God's calling him to do. And then, out of nowhere, and I mean literally out of nowhere, the text shifts, and you come across this narrative where God decides that God's going to kill Moses. Now, the Hebrew here is a little vague. It says God is going to meet him and kill him, but it seems clear from the text that the referent is Moses here. So God's going to kill Moses after explaining all these things about how Moses is going to go into Egypt and rescue the people. But then Zipporah, Moses' wife, cuts off their son's foreskin and touches Moses' feet with it. And then all of a sudden God is like, "Oh, okay, you did that, we're cool then." Again, it's a different culture, it's a different time. I don't know what to tell you. Third, after Moses goes to Egypt and delivers this message from God to Pharaoh, Pharaoh actually gets angry and decides to increase the labors of the Egyptian slaves. The Egyptian slaves then get mad at Moses, saying, "Hey, look, why have you come here? You're just stirring up more trouble for us." And then Moses goes to God, and rather than just saying, "God, I know you're in control, I know you have this," he actually accuses God of evil or harm. The Hebrew word here is ra'ah. But what's more interesting is not just that Moses accuses God of harm, he compares God to Pharaoh. More specifically, the text states, "Then Moses turned again to the Lord and said, 'O Lord, why have you mistreated this people? Why did you ever send me? Since I first came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has mistreated this people, and you have done nothing at all to deliver your people.'" That passage is interesting. You'll note that it's the same English word. God has mistreated the people, Pharaoh has mistreated the people, and that's why I note there's a comparison between God and Pharaoh. Moses is making this comparison. Then there's a call and accusation against God in God's apathy. You have done nothing to deliver them. These are really strong, bold words to speak against God, but God doesn't seem to mind. God doesn't do anything to Moses at this point. In fact, it seems to stir God to action. The fourth thing that's interesting about the relationship between God and Moses, not only does God not chastise Moses for this accusation that Moses brings against God, God reminds Moses that Moses has received a very special honor, that Moses is the only person up to this point that God has revealed God's divine name to, that is, Yahweh. I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself known to them. So Moses is in this really privileged place. He's even received more from God than Abraham did, which is saying a lot. Furthermore, Moses gets to see God. Well, kind of. Moses gets to see God's back? Is it like a mooning kind of situation here? What is this? I don't know. It seems kind of strange to me. Moses wants to see God's glory, and God consents, but says, you can't see my face or you'll die. Man, it's a good thing he doesn't have like a Facebook profile or something like that. Put your face up there, everyone who's just scrolling down their screen just starts dropping dead, right? That'd be like terrible friend. So God shows Moses his back. But the point of this might be that no one can see God fully. Even Moses, who is this close to God, only gets a portion of it. But what I find significant about this is, even with all these accusations and these doubts that Moses is offering up to God, Moses still is the recipient of the divine name and an image or a close representation of God's glory. I find that very interesting and kind of strange. The fifth thing I want to note is that Moses debates with God at one point and actually wins the debate. After God brings the people out of Egypt and they're safe from the Egyptians, God takes the people to this mountain. Moses goes up on the mountain to speak with God, and Moses has gone a long time. Apparently it takes God a long time to say anything. I don't know, maybe he speaks Old Entish. But while Moses is away, the people start to grumble. Where is this Moses fellow? He went up the mountain, he's abandoned us. Where is this God? And then they all turn to Aaron, Moses' brother, and say, we want you to make a God for us. And so Aaron's like, okay. So he gathers up all this gold, he smelts it down and forms it into a golden cow. Because let's face it, if your main concern is that God is a little too wordy, you want a cow on your side. What's a cow gonna say? Nothing. Moo. Maybe if he's talking to Moses, he'll be like, Moses. Moses. But seriously, the reason it's a calf or a bull is because that image, that animal, represents strength and virility in that cultural milieu. Anyway, God's up on the mountain with Moses, and all of a sudden it's like, hey, your people are doing some crazy stuff down there. Leave me alone, because I'm going to destroy them in my anger. And this would be a good time for Moses, being a mere human, to say, hey God, your will not mine be done. I'm a mere mortal. I'm just going to get out of your way. But according to the text, that's not what Moses does. The text states, but Moses implored the Lord his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, with your power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath, change your mind, and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, I will multiply your descendants like the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So Moses doesn't acquiesce to God. Moses is like, hey, this is a bad idea, and I'm going to tell you why. Reason number one, if you bring all the Israelites out to the desert and then slaughter them, all the other nations are going to be like, well, that God's cray-cray. Reason number two, you made a promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. By the way, Israel, another name for Jacob, that he received after he wrestled with God. The name means to struggle with God. Very interesting stuff, but we can talk about that later. Moses says, you made a promise to these people. How are you going to break this promise now? Moses, in essence, enters in debate club with God and presents his arguments and even makes demands of God. Turn from your fierce anger. Change your mind and do not bring disaster. And again, there's that Hebrew word ra'ah upon your people. Now, at this point, we probably imagine God is like, all right, seriously, Moses, just be quiet. I'm going to do what I'm going to do. I'm God. You're not. Let me handle this. But that's not what the text states. In fact, the text states, and the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on his people. Moses actually wins at the debate. God changes God's mind. The Hebrew word here, nacham, to repent, to turn or change one's course. Moses presents the argument, and God listens to Moses. Now, while these 6 interactions are interesting, there's another interaction that I want to highlight, but it doesn't come from the book of Exodus. It comes from the book of Numbers, and it's a very different natured interaction between God and Moses. And it's the 7th point I want to make. According to the book of Numbers, God eventually gets angry at Moses and doesn't let him enter the promised land. The situation is, there's a bunch of people, Israelites, now wandering through the desert, and they're very thirsty, and there's no water around. So God says to Moses, speak to this rock, and the rock will gush out water so everyone can drink. But Moses doesn't speak to the rock. Instead, he hits it twice with his magic stick. And and then water comes out. God is apparently angry at Moses for hitting the rock twice instead of just speaking to it, and this is enough for God to say, you're not going to the party anymore. In other words, you're not entering the promised land. It's kind of weird to think that after everything God and Moses had been through in the Exodus account, that this is the hill that God's going to die on, right? This was the straw that broke the camel's back. This is the point where God draws a line in the sand and says, listen, I'm okay with you accusing me of being no better than Pharaoh. I'm okay with you debating with me and telling me not to do evil. But when I tell you to speak to a rock, you don't hit it with a stick. Come on, that's just common sense. At any rate, God prevents Moses from entering into the promised land, and Moses dies before they ever get there. I want to take a few moments to consider what the nature of the relationship between God and Moses might mean for us today. Now, two of the points that I brought up, where God tries to kill Moses, which seems sort of very unexpected in the narrative, and where God prevents Moses from entering into the promised land in the book of Numbers, seem like God is a little vindictive and does have a little problem with Moses. But the other five that I mentioned, each of them suggests that Moses doubts God, questions God. Moses accuses God of being no better than Pharaoh, makes strong accusations against God, accuses God of apathy and indifference. Moses debates with God, telling God, change your mind, don't do what you're going to do this instead, this is a better plan. And in all of these cases, God seems to embrace the nature of this relationship with Moses. And one of the really interesting things to me is that Moses is held up in both Judaism and Christianity and Islam as a great example of faith. And yet for many of us today, when we think of the word faith, we tend to think, oh, faith is unquestioning. Faith is absolute obedience. Faith doesn't challenge. Faith doesn't doubt. And yet that's at the heart of Moses' relationship with God. This raw honesty with God, this ability to accuse God, to challenge God, to question God. And God seems to embrace this, even identifying it as a faithful relationship. So the Hebrew Scriptures presents this interesting case of a faithful relationship with God that allows for all of these different elements that we might tend to exclude from a faithful relationship today. So I leave it to you. Does the relationship between God and Moses within the wider narrative of the Exodus provide grounds for us to rethink what it means to be faithful? Regardless of your answer, the relationship between God and Moses is fascinating and definitely worth considering, especially when it's placed within the wider context of the Exodus. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Until next time, farewell. So I just looked up wish.com and I'm just terribly, terribly offended by what you said. Oh, don't get me wrong, you're completely right. I'm just offended that you said it.